Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to build this ARL 44 French heavy tank. This is a 35th scale kit from Amusing Hobby. This is my first kit from Amusing Hobby, and spoilers, I rather enjoyed the build, so it won't be my last. If you'd like to have a look at the sprues and other stuff that came in the box, I did a what's in the box video a while ago. I'm not going to repeat all of that here, so if you want to see what the sprues are like, go check that video out. There's a link in the description. Because the purpose of the what's in the box video is to make these videos a bit shorter, I'll stop waffling now and get right to the build. First, we must assemble some wheels, and by some, I mean a lot. There are 18 here, and these are just for the road wheels on one side of the tank. Fortunately, they're pretty easy to put together. One half has the axle moulded into it, which neatly fits into the hole on the other half. The front and rearmost road wheels have a sort of spring thing they should be mounted on, and you'll need to do this before gluing the wheel set together, so hopefully you haven't gotten too carried away and glued all of the wheels together. I did this one half of the tank at a time, so when I had all of the wheels and spring wheels together, I glued the two halves of this big idler wheel together. Then I glue the front and rear road wheels into place, and these are different to each other. The very top part of the spring has different angles, and I guess that's the main way you can tell them apart. If you are using the correct parts, they're not difficult to get into place. Then, I add the rest of the road wheels. The way I did this was just to sit the wheels on one of the wheel framey thingies, and when they're all on, sandwich the whole lot together, and this was a little bit more fiddly than the video shows. Alternatively, you could add glue while you're placing each wheel to lessen the chances of them all falling out of place so easily. Whatever you do, it's not the most difficult assembly, it's just a little bit fiddly on account of there being so many wheels. Don't forget the idler wheel, which goes at this end. There's enough flex here that you should be able to just kind of slip it in like I've done. Once I'm satisfied with everything, I apply glue in various places, both to please the glue god and to make sure the whole assembly will stay together. Unless you've done something terribly wrong, you should end up with two of these very wheelie assemblies. Next, we need a couple more small wheels. They go together just the same as before, only this time, they get mounted into these little frames. There's a backing part to hold them in place like so. It might take a little bit of prodding to get them all the way into place, but this isn't too difficult. There should be 4 of these assemblies, and once they're together, they can be mounted into the upper hull. These will be the return rollers, so you can return the tracks to the front of the tank in a rolling manner. I follow that with these inner hull side bits, whatever you might call them. These are keyed and they almost drop right into place. A little bit of nudging and they're in. Then we can put those big running gear assemblies into place. It was a little bit fiddly to get them to slot into the correct place, it is a bit tight, but it's not too bad. I pressed them in as far as they would go and then applied glue. I figured gluing afterwards would result in less mess if the running gear didn't go into place the first go. If you thought we were finished with the little wheel sets, you were wrong. We need a couple more. This time with this angled mounting bracket sandwiched between them. These are additional return rollers, and they go here on the rear of the whatever you would call this thing. Running gear bulge? Whatever it is, this isn't difficult. Obviously, we've got one on either side. It made sense to then install the whole bottom. This didn't quite drop right into place, and it needed a little bit of kajiggering. Nothing too outrageous though. I figured it made sense to glue it at the front first. That will be the most visible portion. Once I got that to be as nice and gap-free as I could get it, I glued it into place at the rear. It did kind of want to spring back out of place, so I had to hold it for a bit. Sometimes the plastic just wants to be held, you know? To make it a bit less obvious that there's no internal detail, I add the whole rear. This also required some pressure and a bit of holding, but nothing particularly difficult. With the hull nicely sealed up, it's time to add some detail-y bits, like these final drive axle-y parts. There's no keying, so I don't think the positioning of those bolts really matters too much. You'll barely see them anyway, if at all. The thing I just added holds the drive sprockets, so maybe we should probably have some drive sprockets. The main two parts go together nice and easily, with some keying to make sure that both the teeth and the spokes line up properly. Then we add this little cap part, which goes on easily. I didn't bother recording what it looks like here, but I'm sure you'll see it later. I glue together 4 of these little brackety doovers. They've got keying, so it's pretty easy to get them properly aligned. They can go on the hull next because why not? There are some obvious outlines for these, 2 at the front and 2 at the rear. I assume these are for lifting or towing or something of that nature. On the rear we have these, I'm assuming, tail lights. They hang from these little brackety things here, so you've just got to nudge them a bit until they look like gravity is pulling them downwards, as gravity tends to do. Then I add a couple of little rings. These are likely for lifting.
Is it these or the other brackets, Herbert?
I don't know. What do I look like? An ARL 44ologist? I add the drive sprockets next, mostly because the instructions said to. You don't actually need to put these on until you're ready to install the tracks. There are no polycaps to hold these on, but the fit is pretty tight, so they should stay on. If you wanted, you could glue them on. There's no other teeth or anything else that should cause fitting issues when putting the tracks on, but I left them unglued anyway. Next, I add some little lifting brackets to 2 of these platey parts. The bracket is small, so that does add some fiddliness, but it's easy enough. I set those aside, and then deal with the mudguard side skirty track covery part. This one on the left wasn't the most difficult thing I've installed, though I did have a little bit of trouble getting the tabs into the slots, and I had to bend the part a bit. It also required some holding so it would stay there, but I got it on pretty neatly in the end. I didn't video it, but the one on the right side goes on in pretty much the same way, though it was noticeably easier, probably because it doesn't have the same bend as the left one. One concern brought up by chat while I was building this is that there might not be clearance for the tracks with these parts installed, but it turns out there's plenty of space there. Next, I install those plates onto which I added the lift bracket things just before. There's nothing too tricky here, and they kind of slide in under the main hull. Then you press them down a bit so they sit at a slight downward angle. Now it's time for exhaust, and this is a little bit more complicated than the exhaust on most tank kits. First, I glue these 2 curved bits together. Then they connect with this also curved bit. Simple enough so far. Then I glue 2 of these sets of, I guess they're little individual mufflers for each pipe. They get glued into the end part here. For some reason, there's an additional 2 little muffler things that go on the outside edge. They don't look to be any different from the rest, but what would I know? There's probably a good reason for them to be separate. I glue the other end part on and make sure it's all together nice and neat. Then, we add more little muffler doovers. These are very much like the previous lot. The only real difference I can see is the shape of the end part. Obviously, you should follow the instructions to be sure that you're using all the correct parts here. Then, we make another very similar but different assembly, and they both get glued together like so. And then I add some little bars. I almost forgot these, so don't do that. The ones on the bottom pretty much drop right into place, but the upper ones have to be slid through a hole in the middle support thing. It doesn't look anything like the usual exhaust systems, but it does look interesting. It's not quite finished yet. We have to glue the curved front part on, and then it can be attached to the hull. There's a couple of little mounting holes for it on the hull, which is quite helpful. There are brackety bits that contact the hull, and we should add some glue there, otherwise we'll make the glue god mad, and we don't want that. Once that's satisfactorily in place, I assemble the headlamps, which involves pressing the lens part into the lamp body, and in theory that's easy. I did, in practice, have a little bit of trouble with it, but through the magic of editing, it looks like I got it in first try. You'll notice that this is not a clear plastic part, so we're going to have to do some paint trickery to make it look like a real lens later on. Why not install those on the front of the hull now? They go into these little brackets, and it makes sense that they would sit vertically. You may have to do a bit of nudging to get them to sit where they should be. I follow that with this bulge for the hull machine gun. It kind of looked as though the lamp might interfere with it, but it didn't. I then install this nubbin. This is a mount for the towing cable to hook onto, and we'll come back to that later. The travel lock for the main gun comes next, and this pretty much drops right into place into the little brackets at the bottom of the hull front, and it should rest against the hull like so. You could probably also model this with the gun in the locked position, but it would be a bit more fiddly to do so. This bar is also part of the travel lock. It drops into place over the top of the main part of the lock, and I was a little bit worried that it might interfere with the lift ring that will go on below it. But it turned out that I was worried about nothing. I assemble the tracks next, because why not? I don't think the instructions actually said to do this. I think maybe I did it at the end of a stream or something. I didn't assemble every single link on stream because it would have been just way too thrilling to watch. By which I mean kinda tedious. But they do go together pretty easily. In fact, I would say they're probably the easiest individual track links I've ever worked with. You've just got to get them around the right way, at the right angle, and press them together. On the front of the hull we have some tools, pickaxes and hammers and the like. The little bits towards the bottom of the hull that these are sitting on kind of look like they're meant to be pockets, but I don't know. I had to clip some of the handles back a little bit just to get them to fit, so they're probably not perfect, but close enough. Then I add the lift rings along the front of the hull, and as you can see, there was no interference from that bar I mentioned earlier. All 3 rings are easy to position and look very ringy. Time for some hatches. I thought these were kind of interesting. There's a square part which, well, it's not especially exciting, but this curved part that slides back and forth is kind of neat. For some reason it didn't seem to want to sit in the closed position of its own volition, and I guess you could model it open, but I think it looks better closed. So I used the power of glue to convince it to stay where I wanted it. In between those hatches, I install I guess it's a ventilation cover? I don't know. It does go into place easily though. Then, on the right side, we've got this little doodad. I'm pretty sure this is a little hook to hold the towing cable in place. Behind the opening for the turret,
Actually, that's called the turret ring.
I add a couple of little hatches. I think these might be fuel caps, but obviously I don't know for sure. They're pretty easy to place though. I follow that with this piece of pipe. There's some little mounting bracket looking things to help guide it, which makes it pretty simple. And then I add a cap to the end. This makes me think it might be for putting coolant into the radiator or something like that. But again, I have no idea. I'm just guessing.
You need to do your research, Herbert.
Next, I add a couple of little handles on either side of this vent. I assume these are for lifting the cover off, and not handles for infantry joyriding on the engine deck. On either side of the engine deck, next to the forward edge of these vents, I add a couple of brackets. I have no idea what these are or what they're for, but I'm sure they're very important. Just behind those there's a couple of little handles, which are kind of fiddly because of their size, that being small. On the right rear hull side, I add this thing. It's another tow cable holding doodad. It makes sense to put that on before this next bit, which is, I assume, a set of gun cleaning rods. Whatever they are, they go into place here nice and easy. I did need to do a fair bit of holding to get them to stay there, because the part wanted to flex upwards. Glue and pressure were used to tell it no. At the rear end, I add this. What I'm assuming is just a cover for the ends of the cleaning rods. A little bit more holding was required here, but nothing too taxing. Back to the front of the hull, where I add these vision devices. They more or less just plop right into these holes, though the instructions did make it look like they go on those other round things just behind the hatches, so I could be wrong in putting these here, but I don't think I am. Now it's time for photo etch. Hooray! Nothing too tricky with this kit, there's just a few simple bits of mesh that need to be glued into place. The 2 rear ones here are quite easy. There's some guides here that do help quite a bit. Obviously, because photo etch is metal, we need to use superglue to get the parts to stick. The 2 round parts are probably the most difficult here, mostly because there isn't really anything to guide them, so you've got to eyeball them, which, to be clear, doesn't mean using your eyeballs to position them. Though if you could do that, I would be kind of impressed. I put in some extra effort and made sure the mesh was aligned with the hull, just to make it look a bit neater. The final 2 pieces are the smaller vents forward of the round fan openings. These have a sort of recess that they drop into, which makes it quite easy. I know I complain about photo etch pretty much every time it appears, but I really don't mind it when it's just flat pieces like this. It's the bending that makes things complicated and less fun, and obviously there was none of that here. Also, the result is really quite nice. I think it adds a lot, and it's a bit of a shame to cover it up, but that's what the instructions wanted, specifically with these little plates. I guess they're to stop things like maybe grenades or fire from getting in there and causing problems. I've only put 1 set of these plates on because if I'm going to add photo etch, even if it was easy to do, I would really prefer not to then immediately hide it. I think these covers might be optional anyway, and if they're not, well, 2 of them have been stolen by some very naughty children. Let's get the superglue back out and assemble the towing cable. This is comprised of some string, which gets glued into the end parts. It's pretty simple. The instructions do give you a length that you should cut the string to, but as I learned, the given length is a little bit too long. I did cut it down a bit, but it was still too long, and instead of cutting it again, I decided to just go with it. It was actually surprisingly difficult to get the cable end around the mounting pin on the front of the hull, but after a bunch of kajiggering I did get it there. Then I glued the cable into the little retaining hook we added earlier. I also glued it to the running board so that it wouldn't move around. It is obvious that it's a bit longer than it should be, but I'm not especially worried about it. Hopefully the Realistic Towing Cable Length Association of Australia can't find me. Moving on, the time for tracks has arrived, and as you can see, I've put together a few thousand links. That might be a slight exaggeration. There are 63 links per side. Would have been nice if there were 6 more. You can see there's plenty of space for the tracks between the return roller and the guard. I make sure the teeth of the drive sprocket are properly engaging with the tracks, and I also try to position them such that they join up in a place that makes it easy to press them together. It's not hard to connect the tracks to each other off the tank, but it does become a little bit more fiddly to do on the tank, though clearly I've done it, so it's not impossible. You can see there's a little bit of slack, and the drive sprocket still rotates. You could glue all of this together at this point, but I've decided to leave it loose. That way the tracks can be taken off and painted separately, which will obviously be a bit easier, though I don't think painting these tracks in place would be hard at all. Anyway, that's the hull finished, so now it's turret time. I start by gluing this gun holdy doodad together like so. Then, into the little holes on either side, I press these arm bracket things. At this point, they shouldn't be glued in. This is what will hold the gun mantlet, and therefore the gun, in the turret. At first, I misread the instructions and had the arms around the wrong way. What a fool. Fortunately, I noticed before it became a problem. Not gluing these in is really what saved me. Why not then install this in the turret front? There's some pretty obvious keying for this, which ensures that everything is around the right way. Obviously, glue for the glue god, though it's not a bad idea to leave the rotating parts unglued for later adjustment. There's a couple of little doodads to add to the turret front, like this tiny nub, and then a couple of slightly larger hexagonal nubs on either side of where the gun mount is. Their size does make them a little bit fiddly, but they're also keyed, which makes things a bit easier. The gun mantlet goes on next, and as you can see, there's keying to help you get this part on straight and the right way up. Of course, if you've got the inner mounting part around the wrong way, your mantlet will be upside down, so maybe pay attention. I then glue the turret bottom into place, in the bottom of the turret. This fit pretty well, though it did need a little bit of extra pressure and holding, particularly at the rear to avoid the bottom hanging down too far. On the underside at the rear, there's an extra little bit that needs to be glued into place, just to make sure the ring shape is complete. Then, to complete the main body of the turret, why not glue the front on? It would look kind of silly if we didn't. The fit is good, though again, a little bit of pressure was needed to make sure there weren't any unwanted gaps. Nobody wants unwanted gaps, that's why they're called unwanted gaps. Time for some smaller detail-y bits. There's a couple of lifting hooks that go on either side of the turret. As you might expect, these little recesses make it nice and easy. At the front of the turret, there's some doodadery to attach spare track links. There's also recesses here, which make it nice and easy like the previous bits. The lower portion of this is made up of 2 smaller hooky bits. It's worth noting that I didn't show myself installing the spare track links here, but I did in fact do that. You'll be able to see that at the end of the video. On top here, I install a dome. I'm assuming this is a ventilation cover. I follow that with this hatch. You could model this open if you choose, but as you can probably tell, I've chosen closed. Then I install the commander's hatch incorrectly, though at the time I didn't realise it was incorrect, otherwise I wouldn't have done it. I'll fix it later. On the turret's right side, I attach this large box. I would assume this is for escargot, or maybe some baguettes and wine. Who knows what French tanks carried. Behind that, there's a recess for an antenna bracket, so I put the bracket there. It made sense to then put the antenna base on, so I did that. If you wanted, you could add some additional antenna with some styrene or maybe brass rod or even some stretched out sprue. As you might guess, I didn't feel like doing this. At the rear, I add this plate. It had a bit of play to it, so you might need to nudge it so that it lines up nice and straight with the rest of the turret. I forgot to press record for some reason, but the next thing I added was this curved bracket thing. I've got no idea what it's for, maybe for something rounded, like a nice barrel of wine or something.
It's probably military equipment.
You sure about that? At this point I realised my mistake with the commander's hatch. Fortunately, it hadn't yet totally bonded into place, so I was able to force it out with no damage and only a little bit of mess. I reinstalled it the correct way, and you can tell it's on right when the recess for the little hinge thing lines up with the mounting point so you can actually install the part. This is how it should look. You could probably model this open if you wanted, though it would take a bit more work. A small handle goes here, and unlike a lot of the other parts in this kit, there isn't really any obvious mounting hole for it, which made it more fiddly, but not impossible. There is, however, an obvious mounting point for this thing, which I think is a mount for a machine gun. There's no machine gun included to mount here, but if there was, I think that's where it'd go. There may be no machine gun, there is, however, a nice metal main gun barrel. The kit does also include a 2-piece plastic barrel, and I think that'd work fine, but this does look a lot better, and it would be significantly less work. There are no mold lines to clean up, and no potential gaps to fill. The only downside is that you need to use superglue to attach the muzzle brake, which I think is a pretty interesting looking part. And obviously, the superglue is also needed to glue the gun into the turret. There's no keying here, so you've got to make sure you've got it so the muzzle brake isn't all wibbly wobbly, but that is pretty simple. If Herbert Erpaderp can do it, so can you. And that's it. The turret is finished, and it connects onto the hull with a nice simple locking tab mechanism. And just like that, the 35th scale ARL 44 from Amusing Hobby is now completed. I think this is a really nice model, and I'm very happy with it. Other than a couple of little frustrations, like the towing cable not only being too long, but also being kind of tricky to get into place, it was a really fun build. As I probably said, this is my first kit from Amusing Hobby, and, well, I was amused. I don't know if all of their kits are like this, but I am certainly interested in building more of them. I don't really build a lot of French tanks, but they are pretty interesting. There's a lot of stuff on this tank that just looks different to vehicles from other nations, and I guess that could probably really be said about tanks from any country, but I think you know what I'm getting at.
You're waffling, that's what you're getting at.
I guess so. This model was pretty easy to put together. Maybe not easy for a total beginner, but if you've built a few kits you probably won't have an issue with it. There were of course mold lines and things that needed to be cleaned up here and there, but nothing too outrageous. There weren't any real problems putting any of the parts on. None that weren't my fault anyway. Even the photo etch was nice and went on with no issue. I think the detailing here is quite good, though of course I'm not an expert on ARL 44s, or any tanks, so I couldn't point out any potential inaccuracies, but I'm not a rivet counter either, so minor inaccuracies don't really bother me. So I think it's a cool model of an interesting subject, and it was fun to build, as I've said probably a bunch of times now. If you've got any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the comments section below. If you'd like to watch me build kits like this one live, head on over to my Twitch channel, which is where I stream pretty much all of the builds you see on my channel. Be sure to subscribe and click the bell here on YouTube so you can see more of my videos as they come out. And if you'd like to see these videos a bit early, before there's any ads, consider becoming a patron. You can find links to Patreon and all of my other things like Discord and social media in the description below. Take care of yourselves, be excellent to each other, and thanks for watching. Farewell.